Marvel Snap's newest card, Boomerang, is cool, evocative, flavorful, and interesting, but I'm not sure he's going to be metagame relevant. Let's talk about why. Boomerang is a 2/2 with very unique text. When it returns to your hand, it steals 4 power from your opponent's hand. This is randomly targeted, but it's always taking 4 power. If they've got 4 cards in there, it'll randomly pull from those cards. So it might hit some, it might not hit some. They've got 1 card in there, it's taken 4 power from that 1 card. So it's always going to return to hand as a 2/6 and then get played out as a 2/6 and then come back to hand as a 2/10 and then get played out as a 2/10. But that play pattern is the very thing that makes this card read better than it is. Fundamentally, I think a lot of people look at this and they think it functions like an on reveal, but it doesn't, and that matters. If this card were an on reveal, playing it would be 2/6 with steal 4. So that's awesome and we love it. Then it comes back to hand. Then we play it again and we realize those gains immediately. The fact that this card's gains are not realized until it returns to the hand effectively adds 2 energy on to the cost of realizing those gains. So when you play it as a 2/6 or something to that effect, what you're actually doing is playing it as a 4/10, and you have to get all the value from the things that it hit in order for it to be that. If this happened as an on reveal, it would be front loading that value. But because it's Boomerang and presumably designed to be a boomerang card so it works when it comes back to hand, that value is backloaded and it requires an additional investment. So first things first, what are some of the things that you actually want to play with Boomerang, and what are some of the things that you don't want to play with Boomerang but might trick you? One thing that you definitely want to play with Boomerang is ways to return him that aren't built into his own effect. He has an activate ability that sends him back to your hand, but you kind of want to be doing that as much as you possibly can. And you especially want to be doing that for as little energy as you possibly can. I could have put Tox in here, but Beast is Boomerang's much better partner, even though you're probably running both in any deck that's playing either. This is a card that brings Boomerang back to your hand and discounts him so you can do that again very efficiently. If you're ever going to get to multi-Boomerang plays, it is going to be with Beast and with Toxin, and Beast is going to be the better of the two. Now, Beast is an extremely powerful card in bounce decks, but that actually brings us to one of the larger issues that Boomerang has, which is that he is a bounce card. Bounce as an archetype is not bad, but it's also not very good. This is a deck that typically wants to play games of Marvel Snap by getting as much power as it can on the board over the course of the game, then putting that power in hand. When that power is located in hand, it can then be better at distributing the power than mid-range decks whose all their power is located on the board. So you have a similar amount of power to them, but you're better at actually allocating it where it needs to go, effectively leveraging information advantage because you spent all this time building up your power, but it's actually all in your hand and ideally all discounted and very cheap, so you can put it in the locations where it'll actually win. That has always been the ethos of bounce decks. One of the biggest things that this helps them do is dodge tech. It's very powerful to be a bounce list that is able to avoid getting Shadow Kinged and Shang-Chi'd and Killmonger when so many of your points are invested in things that would be vulnerable to them. This is, unfortunately, a problem in the current metagame. And it's because of this guy. Gambit, Horseman of Death, fires after the final turn. If you don't trigger him until the final turn, he'll be firing after that. The biggest advantage bounce decks have is the ability to throw priority. This is paired with their incredible point allocation to make them a viable deck that plays through both tech and mid-rangey decks. They are typically a deck that is extremely good at beating mid-rangey stuff. Here's the problem. This is kind of the dominant mid-range shell, and the way Gambit works directly counters your advantages. You're building up a Rocket Raccoon on Joaquin Torres that has 14 power. That's awesome, except it dies. You're building up a Sage. That's awesome, except it dies. Your Hit Monkey dies. etc., etc. The fact that this card manages to obliterate so much of bounce archetypes is a big part of why I think Boomerang has not felt as good as he otherwise could. There are a couple things where it comes into why Boomerang feels like he's a bit mid, and I do think Gambit Horseman is at the top of the list because of the way bounce decks typically like to play. Of course, there is also the issues with front loading, but I do think that primarily Gambit is a inversion of type. These are decks that are typically going to lose to a bounce deck because the bounce deck is able to do points better and more efficiently and allocate them better and more efficiently. And instead, they just have a card that says, actually, you lose this matchup. I also wanted to shout out a special slops here. We've talked about some props. Here's some slops, although I suppose the Gambit one was also slops. Slops to Morgan Le Fay and the way this is worded. Morgan Le Fay is worded such that you'd think it might work with Boomerang. Boomerang returns to your hand off of Morgan Le Fay. Yeah, that doesn't work. I don't know why. I have no real explanation for why the same word is being used here with different functional intent, but I don't like it. Let's talk about decks you can play Boomerang in. The biggest thing that Boomerang does is do some reasonably useful stuff in a bounce deck. This is a very fine card for this archetype that I really do think is actually pretty decent here. He costs 2, which I understand why he doesn't cost 1, because that would be pretty patently broken. And the biggest sadness you get with him is the second cost. That is kind of a serious problem. But Bounce is a deck that occasionally is floating enough energy that you're just happy to have a guy that returns from hand. And also, he does have some natural upside in certain situations where he can return on his own if you want to set up something else on that lane. I really don't think he's all that bad, and the value you get out of him is pretty pronounced. This is definitely a card that would matter more in a mid-rangier meta. It would matter more if Gambit wasn't running around doing what he's doing, but I do think that I am non-zero at least okay with him. The sentiment on him is bad, but I think the sentiment on him is bad because of the weaknesses of the bounce archetype, i.e. it's a combo-ish deck that can't beat Captain Carter, and the mid-range deck of de jour is playing Gambit, so it can't beat that either. And neither of those things are Boomerang's fault. But you can see the bounce deck here doing a little bit of modification of type in order to just try to be a little bit bigger. Having things like Mother Ascani, Sholau, and Sasquatch in the list means that you are much more able to play through a Gambit by making a bunch of really big guys. That's a big part of the reality of the situation for a bounce deck right now. And the fundamental thing is that this guy doesn't really change any of that. It's nice that he's doing what he's doing, and stealing 4 from your opponent's hand is really not that bad, especially if it comes attached to a 2/6 that you can play later, but it's not necessarily worth the time investment. And very often, the fact that he costs 2, while that is nice, just means that he kind of gets blown up by a Gambit anyway. Not a horrible thing, but definitely not the focal point of this deck. You can also try to play things more traditionally and just say, look, I'm going to play a fair deck and I'm going to play against other people playing fair decks. And if they're playing fair decks, I'm probably still going to be better than them. And Boomerang is actually pretty nice here. I spent a lot of yesterday playing Aurora, and Boomerang was like, oh, that's actually a meaningful card for my deck. Oh man, my Iska lost the point of power. That actually sucks, right? There's certain decks against which this kind of thing is good. It's just that right now, the top tier of Marvel Snap, it's not necessarily in that space, but that's not to say any of this stuff is unplayable. I think that a lot of people look at it and they say well, it loses to A, it loses to B, where A and B are the 2 best decks in the game. That makes it unplayable. I don't think that makes it unplayable. This deck can win games. I don't really want to act like this deck can't win games. It just has some pronounced weaknesses to some of the best decks in Marvel Snap right now, and you'll feel that if you try to do that. And I think that is, this is probably a much more traditional list that you're going to see a lot more of, a much more put together, straightforward. I know what I'm doing every game. I'm doing bounce stuff. I don't have to make any hard decisions. I'm just playing straightforward bounce decks with a fairly limited amount of output, but enough scary stuff. And Iceman particularly is just a really great card. The combination of Iceman and Boomerang can really mess people's hands up, but I do think Iceman is doing a ton of the work there. I largely think that Bounce is a pretty okay deck, and it's just not as okay to be an okay deck normally. One mildly off the wall but fairly convincing home for this card is in the C6 deck. C6 does not have good things at early parts of the curve. Just doesn't have anything that you're happy with, right? We used to play Ezekiel Sims in this slot. He was terrible. I am fairly convinced that Boomerang is at the very least better than Ezekiel Sims because it will cost 6 when you activate it. All you do with him is you play him, you activate him, you play him again. He's 6. That is significantly easier than Sims. I know it doesn't seem like it would be significantly easier than Sims. It is. That guy is horrendous here. He is so bad. He does have a similar downside to Sims, which is that if you pull him off Malekith, kind of sucks. But ultimately, I do think that this deck is one that can support him, is happy to try to support him, and really needs that extra 2-cost card that can actually be that. And I think that Sims is so bad that I am willing to believe that this is an actual home for Boomerang because of how much I've hated playing Ezekiel Sims in C6. Now, C6, for a little bit of a refresher, is a unique version of the Cerebro deck that is really trying to draw its whole deck as much as it possibly can. Thanks to things like Malekith Grandmaster and Crystal Grandmaster, you are really consistently getting to Cerebro, you are really consistently moonstoning Cerebro, and you have a non-zero amount of interaction because you get to play Cosmic Ghost Rider, and Cosmic Ghost Rider is amazing. This is a real thing that you can do, and I do think that it would not shock me if this was actually his best deck. I've also seen some people messing around with Boomerang in a move bounce shell. This is, I think, I won't say inspired, but I think he's a weirdly better fit here than he is in traditional bounce because move bounce's cards are much more conditional. There are many more situations in a move bounce shell where I am floating the 2 energy I would need to just be playing this guy out. And I think that is really interesting and really notable, that this deck is really something that takes advantage of what Boomerang's shape is, which is to say, if you just happen to be floating 2 energy fairly often in a bounce deck, he's pretty good. The typical bounce decks have actually become much better at not floating energy. When you see those Mother Ascani, Sholau, Sasquatch decks, or those decks that are really filling up the final turn of the game like that, this deck is very often going to have the ability to float stuff because that's going to be the optimal play, is to just not play anything else that turn. And I think there really is something to be said about why this is a functional thing to do and what Boomerang is actually looking for. It's looking for you to have a little bit of extra energy. And if you just happen to have that by the nature of your deck being kind of finicky, I think he actually fits better here than he does in the other list. But that's not to say that this is a good fit for him in terms of the other side of it. This is a deck that fits what Boomerang's, I guess, downside is. He fits the downside shape here, but he doesn't necessarily fit the upside shape. He's fine, but not necessarily what this deck is trying to do when it wants to nut off or anything like that. And that's not great either. On the whole, Boomerang is a reasonable card in an unreasonable deck. I won't necessarily compare him to Tombstone because he's a little better than Tombstone is and he's a little bit of a different role, but he's not far off where it's like, I can see this card being good. I find it hard to believe the archetype is good, and Boomerang is a very archetype specific card, and because Boomerang is a very archetype specific card, things are just happening to him. And those things are not his fault, but they are something that you have to take into account when you're looking at evaluating this card. All right, y'all. Thank you so much for watching. As always, I've been KMBest. You've been phenomenal, and I will see you in the next one.